In the summer of 1758, a Spanish captain named Diego Ortiz Parilla watched in horror as 2,000 Comanche warriors materialized from the Texas plains like thunder made flesh. They moved with their horses as if welded together by some ancient magic, firing arrows with deadly precision while riding at full gallop, wheeling and striking with choreographed violence that no European military manual had ever contemplated. Within hours, the mighty Spanish Empire's northernmost mission lay in smoking ruins, its soldiers scattered or dead, its dreams of conquest shattered by a people who had learned to remake themselves in barely 2 generations. What Parilla witnessed that day was not just a raid, it was the flex of an empire that would dominate the heart of North America for longer than the United States has existed. This is the story of the most successful indigenous empire in North American history, built not with stone cities or written laws, but with horses, arrows, and an audacity that redrew the map of a continent. The Comanche didn't just resist European colonization, they stopped it cold, carved out a territory larger than most European nations, and for 150 years dictated terms to Spain, Mexico, and the United States from horseback. They transformed themselves from a marginal mountain tribe into the lords of the southern plains through sheer force of will and tactical genius, creating a mobile empire that moved like lightning and struck like thunder. Their story reads like mythology, but every thundering hoofbeat, every impossible raid, every diplomatic masterstroke actually happened and changed the course of American history forever. The horse that would change the world stood trembling in a mountain meadow sometime around 1680, its flanks heaving from the long climb up from the Rio Grande Valley. The Spanish vaquero who had ridden it into the Colorado Rockies lay dead 3 days now, his blood long since frozen in the early winter snow. But the horse lived, and with it lived possibility. Though the small band of Shoshone hunters who found it that morning could never have imagined they were staring at the instrument of their own transformation. These were the New Munu, the people, though history would remember them by their enemy's name, Comanche. They were nobody special in 1680, just another scattered tribe of mountain foragers scratching out survival in the high country of present-day Wyoming and Colorado. They walked everywhere, as humans had walked for millennia, following game trails and seasonal camps with dogs hauling their meager possessions on travois. They were tough, adaptable, and utterly unremarkable, indistinguishable from dozens of other tribes scattered across the western mountains. The Spanish, when they encountered them at all, dismissed them as chichimecas, barbarians barely worth mentioning in dispatches to Mexico City. But that horse changed everything. The Spanish had been hemorrhaging horses across the Southwest for nearly a century. Each Apache raid and Pueblo revolt scattering more of the animals into the wilderness. Most died. Some went feral. A precious few found their way to indigenous hands where they faced an uncertain fate. Many tribes tried to ride and failed, treating horses as exotic meat or strange pack animals. Others managed basic horsemanship, but never transcended the limitations of their pedestrian past. The Shoshone bands that would become the Comanche possessed something different, a cultural plasticity that bordered on genius, an ability to reinvent themselves completely when opportunity demanded it. Within a single generation, these mountain walkers became centaurs. While other tribes struggled to stay mounted, young Comanche boys were learning to cling to horses' necks before they could properly walk. They developed techniques that seemed to defy physics, shooting arrows with deadly accuracy while hanging beneath a galloping horse's belly, using their mount's body as a shield. They learned to control their horses with subtle shifts of weight and leg pressure, keeping both hands free for weapons. Most remarkably, they discovered they could live entirely on horseback, eating, sleeping, even conducting diplomatic councils without ever touching the ground. The transformation was so complete it astonished contemporary observers. A French trader named Jean-Baptiste Bernard de la Harpe, encountering them in the 1710s, wrote that they seemed born on horseback, as if they had emerged from some mythological realm where humans and horses had always been one creature. What La Harpe was witnessing was cultural evolution in hyperdrive, a people literally remaking themselves from the ground up. But horses alone didn't create an empire. The real genius lay in what the Comanche did next. They followed the herd south. The great buffalo migration routes that had sustained plains tribes for centuries suddenly became superhighways for mounted hunters. Where their Shoshone cousins remained scattered across the mountain basins, content with their traditional seasonal rounds, the bands that would become the Comanche made a decision that would echo through centuries. They abandoned the mountains entirely and committed their entire civilization to life on the rolling grasslands of the southern plains. It was an audacious gamble. The plains were not empty. They were home to established tribes like the Apache, who had dominated the region for generations. These were proven warriors who knew every water hole, every seasonal camp, every strategic advantage the landscape offered. They had Spanish weapons, extensive trade networks, and the confidence that comes from centuries of regional dominance. By any rational calculation, a small band of mountain refugees should have been annihilated within months. Instead, the Comanche began to win. Their first victories came not through grand battles, but through 1,000 small encounters where superior mobility trumped local knowledge. Comanche raiders could strike deep into Apache territory, seize horses and captives, and vanish back into the vastness before any response could be organized. They fought like ghosts, appearing from impossible directions, striking with devastating speed, and melting away before their enemies could retaliate. Within decades, they had not just displaced the Apache from prime hunting grounds. They had absorbed Apache warriors, women and children into their own ranks, growing stronger with each victory. The most profound transformation, however, was happening within Comanche society itself. The pedestrian bands that had entered the plains began to fragment and reorganize around the demands of mounted warfare. New leaders emerged, men whose authority came not from traditional hereditary claims, but from their ability to organize successful raids and manage vast horse herds. The old seasonal patterns of mountain life gave way to the fluid rhythms of the buffalo hunt and the war trail. Even their language began to change, developing new vocabulary for concepts that had never existed in their mountain homeland. Words for different types of raids, for horse breeding, for the complex social relationships that bound together an empire on horseback. By 1750, the transformation was complete. The scattered Shoshone bands that had stumbled upon that first Spanish horse had become something entirely new. The most formidable light cavalry force in North America, masters of a domain that stretched from the Arkansas River to the Rio Grande. They had not just adapted to horses, they had used horses to reinvent the very concept of what an indigenous society could become. The mountain walkers were gone forever. In their place rode the lords of the southern plains, and the world would never be the same. The Comanche war chief known as Cuerno Verde, Greenhorn, could fire 27 arrows in the time it took a Spanish musketeer to reload once. This wasn't boastful legend, but cold mathematics, witnessed and recorded by terrified enemies who lived to tell the tale. Greenhorn had perfected what military historians would later recognize as the most devastating display of mounted archery since the Mongol hordes swept across Asia. But unlike Genghis Khan's warriors, who had centuries to develop their techniques, the Comanche created their revolutionary warfare system in barely 2 generations, and then used it to humble 2 European empires. The secret lay not just in their individual skill, but in their complete reimagining of what warfare could be. While European armies still thought in terms of linear formations and static positions, the Comanche had discovered something far more deadly: the principle of fluid violence. They moved like water, flowing around obstacles, finding weaknesses, striking with concentrated force before dispersing again into the vastness of the plains. It was guerrilla warfare, perfected by masters who had turned the entire landscape into their weapon. Their training began in infancy. Comanche children learned to ride before they learned to walk properly, their small hands gripping horsehair while their mothers galloped across the prairie. By age 4, they were shooting blunt arrows at targets while mounted. By 10, they could guide their horses with nothing but knee pressure, leaving both hands free for bow and lance. The most gifted young warriors underwent a brutal apprenticeship that would have broken European cavalrymen. Learning to sleep in the saddle during long raids, to eat and drink without dismounting, to endure days of pursuit without losing their seats or their effectiveness in combat. But technique was only half the equation. The other half was the horses themselves, and here the Comanche displayed a genius for breeding and management that astounded contemporary observers. They understood that different types of warfare require different types of mounts: swift, lightly built horses for reconnaissance and pursuit, powerful, steady animals for buffalo hunting, specially trained war horses that would respond to their riders' commands even in the chaos of battle. A successful Comanche warrior might own 50 to 100 horses, each selected and trained for specific purposes. Their war horses became legendary for their intelligence and loyalty. These animals learned to stop instantly when their rider fell, to strike with their hooves at enemies on foot, even to carry wounded warriors to safety without guidance. Spanish accounts describe horses that seemed to anticipate their riders' tactical decisions, wheeling and charging as if reading their masters' minds. The bond between Comanche warrior and warhorse transcended mere partnership. It was a fusion of human intelligence and animal instinct that created something entirely new in the annals of warfare. The Comanche developed tactics that exploited every advantage their mobility provided. The feigned retreat became their signature maneuver. Warriors would race toward enemy positions, loose a devastating volley of arrows, then wheel away as if in panic. Pursuing enemies would find themselves strung out in ragged pursuit formations, perfect targets for the second wave of Comanche warriors who had been circling unseen. By the time the trap closed, disciplined European formations had dissolved into chaos, their officers dead or scattered, their formations shattered by an enemy that struck like lightning and vanished like smoke. They perfected the art of the running fight, maintaining continuous pressure on enemies across vast distances. A Comanche war party could harry Spanish columns for days, never offering decisive battle but inflicting steady casualties through hit-and-run attacks that wore down both men and morale. European military doctrine had no answer for an enemy that refused to stand and fight according to established rules of engagement. The Comanche had discovered asymmetric warfare and elevated it to an art form. Their raids became exercises in psychological warfare as much as military conquest. They struck without warning, often traveling hundreds of miles to attack targets that seemed impossibly distant from Comanche territory. The message was clear: nowhere was safe, no Spanish settlement too remote, no Mexican ranch too well defended. The very unpredictability of their attacks multiplied their terror effect far beyond their actual numbers. A few hundred Comanche warriors could paralyze entire regions, forcing thousands of settlers to abandon their homes and retreat to fortified towns. The Comanche also revolutionized siege warfare through pure audacity. When they encountered Spanish presidios or fortified missions, they didn't attempt to breach the walls. They simply waited. Their mobility meant they could maintain loose sieges indefinitely, cutting off supply lines and communications while living off the land. Garrisons that might have held out for months against conventional armies found themselves slowly starved into submission by enemies who seemed to materialize from thin air and disappear just as mysteriously. Perhaps most remarkably, they learned to coordinate large-scale operations across vast distances without any centralized command structure. Different bands would synchronize their attacks through an intricate system of smoke signals, messenger networks, and pre-arranged meeting points. Spanish authorities, accustomed to dealing with hierarchical military structures, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to think and move as a single organism, despite being scattered across thousands of square miles. The culmination of their tactical evolution came with the development of what military analysts would later term deep strike capability. Comanche war parties began launching raids that penetrated hundreds of miles into enemy territory, striking targets in central Mexico that Spanish authorities had considered absolutely secure. These weren't mere cattle raids, but sophisticated military operations that required months of planning, precise intelligence gathering, and flawless execution across hostile terrain. By 1750, the transformation was complete. The Comanche had not merely adopted European horses, they had used them to create an entirely new form of warfare that would influence military thinking for generations. Their tactics would be studied by U.S. Army officers, their mobility principles would inspire cavalry doctrines, and their psychological warfare techniques would become standard practice in conflicts around the world. They had become what no indigenous people in the Americas had ever been before. A military force capable of dictating terms to European empires from a position of strength. The age of Comanche dominance was about to begin, and the world was about to learn what happened when masters of war and horse decided to build an empire. Colonel Diego Ortiz Parilla had conquered half a continent for the Spanish crown. His resume read like an empire's fever dream. Victories in Italy, campaigns in Morocco, the subjugation of countless indigenous peoples across New Spain. He was the kind of professional soldier who had built the Spanish Empire into a global colossus, a man who understood that European military superiority was not just technological, but inevitable. So when the Viceroy of New Spain assigned him to establish Spanish authority over the troublesome Comanche in 1759, Parilla approached the task with the casual confidence of a man who had never known defeat. 18 months later, he would flee across the Texas plains in absolute terror, his army shattered, his reputation in ruins, and his unshakable faith in European invincibility destroyed forever. The Comanche had just delivered a lesson that would echo through the halls of power from Mexico City to Madrid. The age of easy conquest was over. The collision had been building for decades. As Comanche power expanded southward through the 1740s, Spanish authorities watched their northern frontier crumble piece by piece. Missions were abandoned, settlements evacuated, and entire regions effectively ceded to Comanche control. But rather than recognizing the emergence of a new power that required diplomatic engagement, Spanish officials chose to see only savage raiders who could be crushed through sufficient application of force. The Spanish strategy was breathtakingly arrogant in its simplicity. They would ally with the Apache, the Comanche's bitter enemies, and use them as shock troops to destroy the upstart tribe. Then, with the Comanche eliminated, they would extend their mission system deep into the heart of Texas, converting and controlling the Apache, just as they had done with countless other indigenous peoples. It was colonialism by the numbers, a playbook that had worked from Peru to the Philippines. The centerpiece of this grand strategy was the Mission San Saba de la Santa Cruz, established in 1757 near present-day Menard, Texas. This wasn't just another frontier outpost, but a declaration of intent. Spain was claiming the heart of Comancheria itself. The mission was designed to convert the Apache, who would then serve as a buffer between Spanish settlements and Comanche raiders. It was European divide-and-conquer tactics at their most sophisticated, backed by the full weight of imperial authority. The Comanche response was swift and unambiguous. On March 16, 1758, nearly 2,000 warriors descended on the mission like an avalanche of fury. But this wasn't a typical raid. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of power designed to send an unmistakable message to the Spanish Empire. The attackers wore war paint in Spanish colors, flew French flags to mock Spanish diplomatic efforts, and carried lances topped with ribbons as if they were European cavalry. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. The Comanche were not merely rejecting Spanish authority, they were mocking it. The mission's defenders never had a chance. The wooden palisades that might have stopped Apache raiders were useless against an enemy that could coordinate complex maneuvers while mounted. Comanche warriors flowed around the fortifications like water around a stone, striking from multiple directions simultaneously while maintaining devastating fire from their short bows. Within hours, the mission was in flames, its priests dead, and its Apache converts either killed or carried away as captives. But the real genius of the attack lay in its restraint. The Comanche could have massacred everyone at the mission, but instead they spared several Spanish soldiers and sent them back to carry word of what had happened. The message was clear. This wasn't random violence, but calculated policy. The Spanish Empire had just been served notice that its expansion had reached its absolute limit. Colonel Parker received that message with the fury of a man who had never been told no by anyone darker skinned than himself. His response was everything the Comanche could have hoped for. A massive punitive expedition designed to crush the upstart tribe once and for all. Parker assembled nearly 600 men, Spanish regulars, colonial militia, Apache allies, and allied tribes from across the region. It was the largest military force ever assembled on the Texas frontier, armed with cannon, muskets, and the absolute confidence that European military superiority would prevail. The expedition marched north in September 1759, following the Red River toward the heart of Comanche territory. Parker's plan was textbook European. Find the enemy's main village, destroy it with superior firepower, and demonstrate Spanish power so decisively that further resistance would be unthinkable. His Apache guides assured him that the Comanche would scatter at the first sight of Spanish cannon, just as indigenous peoples had done for centuries. Instead, on October 7, 1759, Parker found himself facing something no Spanish officer had ever encountered: a fully mobilized indigenous army that wanted to fight. Nearly 600 Comanche and Wichita warriors had assembled in a fortified village on the Red River, and they were ready for battle on their own terms. The village itself was a marvel of military engineering, surrounded by a wooden palisade and a dry moat, with carefully prepared fields of fire and multiple escape routes. The defenders had even raised French flags to taunt their Spanish attackers, a subtle reminder that Europe's great rival was watching this contest with considerable interest. What followed was a military disaster that would haunt Spanish nightmares for generations. Parker's cannon, the supposed trump card of European warfare, proved useless against mobile defenders who simply melted away whenever the guns were aimed in their direction. His Apache allies, supposedly eager for revenge against their Comanche enemies, fled at the first sight of serious resistance. His Spanish regulars, trained for European battlefields, found themselves helpless against an enemy that refused to stand still long enough to be shot. The Comanche and their Wichita allies fought with tactical sophistication that astounded the surviving Spanish officers. They used the terrain to their advantage, launching coordinated attacks from multiple directions, while maintaining devastating fire from their bows. When Spanish cavalry charged, the defenders simply opened their lines and let the horsemen through, then closed ranks and cut them off from retreat. It was military artistry of the highest order, executed by warriors whom Spanish authorities had dismissed as primitive savages. After 8 hours of futile combat, Parker ordered a retreat that quickly became a rout. His artillery was abandoned, his supplies scattered, and his reputation destroyed. The supposedly invincible Spanish war machine had been humiliated by an enemy that European military doctrine insisted shouldn't exist. Indigenous warriors who could outfight European professionals on their own terms. The political earthquake that followed the Red River disaster reached all the way to the royal court in Madrid. For the first time in centuries, Spanish expansion had been stopped cold by indigenous resistance. The northern frontier, once seen as ripe for conquest, was suddenly recognized as the border of a genuine indigenous empire that could defend itself against European military power. The Comanche had achieved something unprecedented in the history of European colonialism. They had forced a major European power to accept their sovereignty through military defeat. The Spanish Empire, master of 2 continents and controller of the world's silver supply, had been forced to acknowledge that there were limits to its expansion. The age of Comanche dominance had officially begun, and the world had just witnessed the birth of North America's most successful indigenous empire. From Mexico City to Madrid, the lesson was clear. The Comanche were not subjects to be conquered, but equals to be negotiated with. The Spanish reckoning was complete, and a new power had risen on the Great Plains. There was no capital city, no written constitution, no standing army. Yet by 1800, the Comanche Empire controlled more territory than most European nations. From the Arkansas River in Kansas to the Rio Grande in Mexico, from the mesas of eastern Colorado to the pine forests of East Texas, an invisible empire stretched across 240,000 square miles of the North American heartland. It was governed by handshake agreements and horse trades, defended by warriors who materialized from thin air, and administered by chiefs whose authority derived not from bloodlines, but from their ability to deliver results. European diplomats, accustomed to dealing with kings and presidents, found themselves negotiating with an empire that existed everywhere and nowhere, a political entity so revolutionary that it defied every category their political science could comprehend. The genius of Comancheria lay not in what it built, but in what it chose not to build. While European empires exhausted themselves constructing massive bureaucracies and permanent infrastructure, the Comanche created something far more flexible. A confederation of autonomous bands bound together by shared culture, mutual advantage, and the gravitational pull of success. Each band, the Penateca in the south, the Kotsoteca in the north, the Quahada in the west, the Yamparica in the east, and dozens of smaller groups, operated as an independent political entity. Yet when crisis demanded unity, they could coordinate their actions across vast distances with a speed and efficiency that left their enemies stunned. The political architecture was deceptively simple. Each band was led by a Paraibo, a peace chief whose authority derived from wisdom, generosity, and diplomatic skill. War chiefs commanded during raids and battles, but held no permanent political power. Decisions were made through consensus in council meetings, where any warrior could speak his mind, and even women wielded considerable behind-the-scenes influence through kinship networks that often determined which chiefs rose to prominence. It was democracy with a Comanche twist, fluid, merit-based, and utterly practical. But the real binding force of the empire was economic, and here the Comanche displayed a sophistication that amazed contemporary observers. They had discovered something that European mercantilists were only beginning to understand. Control the trade routes, and you control the continent. The ancient Native American trade networks that had carried shells from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies to the Mississippi, and turquoise from the Southwest to the Atlantic seaboard, all of these now flowed through Comanche territory, and the Comanches intended to collect their toll. Their master stroke was cornering the market in the one commodity that every Plains tribe desperately needed: horses. Through a combination of breeding programs, trading expeditions, and strategic raiding, the Comanche became the primary suppliers of horses to tribes across the Great Plains and beyond, Their vast herds, some estimates suggest they controlled more horses than all other Plains tribes combined, gave them leverage that extended far beyond their military might. A Comanche trade delegation arriving at a Pawnee village wasn't just offering horses, they were offering the key to prosperity, military effectiveness, and social prestige. The horse trade created a web of dependencies that stretched from Canada to Mexico. Tribes that had been traditional enemies found themselves cooperating to maintain access to Comanche horses. The Wichita became junior partners in the enterprise, providing agricultural products and serving as intermediaries with more distant tribes. Even French traders from Louisiana and Spanish merchants from Santa Fe found themselves operating within a system where Comanche preferences determined trade routes and market prices. The annual trade gatherings became legendary spectacles that drew thousands of participants from dozens of tribes. These weren't mere commercial exchanges, but diplomatic summits where alliances were forged, disputes settled, and the balance of power across the plains constantly recalibrated. A successful trade chief could emerge from these gatherings with influence that rivaled any European diplomat, having negotiated agreements that would shape events across half a continent. The Comanche also pioneered what modern analysts would recognize as economic warfare. They learned to use their control of trade routes as a weapon more devastating than any army. When the Spanish attempted to enforce trade restrictions, the Comanche simply rerouted commerce around Spanish territories, devastating local economies while enriching their own allies. When rival tribes challenged their authority, they found themselves cut off from horse markets and trade networks essential to their survival. Perhaps most remarkably, they managed to play three different European powers against each other while serving their own interests. Spanish traders from Santa Fe offered silver and manufactured goods. French merchants from Louisiana provided guns and ammunition. American traders who began appearing after 1803 brought different advantages: better prices, superior craftsmanship, and a willingness to ignore traditional diplomatic protocols. The Comanche welcomed them all, played each against the others, and grew wealthy from the competition. Their diplomatic sophistication consistently outmaneuvered European professionals. Comanche chiefs learned to negotiate separate agreements with different colonial powers, sometimes simultaneously promising the same concessions to multiple parties while delivering on none. They understood that European authorities were constrained by written treaties and formal procedures, while Comanche diplomacy remained fluid and adaptable. What Europeans saw as treachery, the Comanche saw as tactical flexibility, and it worked brilliantly. The territorial organization of Comancheria reflected this same practical genius. Rather than claiming fixed boundaries marked by fortifications or monuments, they established zones of influence that ebbed and flowed with the seasons, the migration patterns of buffalo herds, and the shifting balance of military power. During summer buffalo hunts, Comanche authority might extend deep into traditional Kiowa territory. During winter encampments, it might contract to well-defended river valleys and sheltered canyons. The empire breathed with the rhythm of the plains, expanding and contracting but never disappearing. This territorial flexibility drove European cartographers to distraction. Spanish officials attempting to map the northern frontier found that Comanche territories seemed to shift from season to season, making it impossible to establish fixed boundaries or negotiate meaningful territorial agreements. American surveyors after 1803 faced the same problem. How do you map an empire that exists in motion rather than in static locations? The Comanche solved the problem of governing vast distances through an innovation that European political theorists were only beginning to contemplate: federalism. Each band maintained complete autonomy over its internal affairs while recognizing shared interests that transcended local concerns. When external threats emerged, the bands could coordinate their responses through a complex network of kinship ties, mutual obligations, and shared strategic interests. When those threats disappeared, they resumed their independence without missing a beat. By 1820, this invisible empire had become the dominant power across the southern plains, dictating terms to 3 European successor states and dozens of Native American tribes. They had created something entirely new in world history, a nomadic empire that controlled territory not through occupation, but through mobility, not through bureaucracy, but through consensus, not through coercion, but through the irresistible attraction of success. The Empire of the Four Winds had risen, and the world was still trying to figure out exactly what it was looking at. In the summer of 1840, a Mexican farmer named José Hernández was harvesting corn in his fields near Saltillo, nearly 400 miles south of the Texas border, when he looked up to see death approaching on horseback. A line of Comanche warriors stretched across the horizon like a mirage made malevolent, their lances glinting in the afternoon sun, their horses' hooves raising a dust cloud that darkened the sky. Hernandez had heard stories of Comanche raids, of course, but those were tales from the distant frontier, nightmares that belonged to other people in other places. Saltillo was deep in the heart of Mexico, protected by hundreds of miles of desert and dozens of fortified towns. No enemy could possibly penetrate so far into the very soul of the Mexican Republic. José Hernández was about to discover that he lived in the Comanche Empire, and he had simply never been informed. The great raids that terrorized Mexico and Texas for nearly a century represent something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. The systematic projection of military power across distances that should have been impossible for a pre-industrial society. These weren't desperate forays by desperate people, but carefully planned expeditions that penetrated deeper into enemy territory than many modern armies have ever attempted. A Comanche war party could travel from their home camps in present-day Oklahoma to the outskirts of Mexico City, a journey of more than 1,000 miles, fight battles along the way, and return home with thousands of stolen horses and dozens of captives. They turned the entire geography of North America into their personal hunting ground, and they did it with nothing more than horses, arrows, and an audacity that bordered on madness. The raids followed seasonal rhythms as predictable as the phases of the moon, yet remained impossible to defend against. Each autumn, after the buffalo hunts ended and the grass had cured into winter feed, war parties would begin forming across Comancheria. Young men eager to prove themselves would join seasoned warriors looking to increase their wealth and status. Chiefs would organize these individual ambitions into expeditions that could number anywhere from a dozen riders to several hundred, depending on the target and the expected resistance. The preparation was meticulous. Scouts would have spent months gathering intelligence about potential targets. Which ranches had the most horses, which settlements were poorly defended, which trade routes carried the most valuable cargo. Routes would be planned to take advantage of seasonal water sources and avoid known military patrols. Each warrior would prepare specialized equipment, extra bowstrings, carefully selected arrows, war medicine, and backup horses trained to carry wounded riders to safety. But the true genius of the raids lay in their psychological impact, which multiplied their military effectiveness far beyond their actual numbers. The Comanche had discovered that terror was a force multiplier more potent than any weapon. A single successful raid that penetrated deep into supposedly secure territory could paralyze an entire region for months. Settlers would abandon their homes, traders would refuse to travel established routes, and military forces would be scattered across vast areas trying to defend everything, and thus protecting nothing. The Great Raid of September 1840 became the stuff of legend precisely because it demonstrated the impossible had become routine. A force of perhaps 1,000 Comanche warriors, led by the war chief Buffalo Hump, swept down from the hill country of central Texas like an avalanche of vengeance. They had a specific target in mind, the port city of Linville on the Gulf Coast, where valuable trade goods were stored before shipment to New Orleans and beyond. But getting there meant penetrating through hundreds of miles of settled territory, past dozens of towns and military posts, through the very heart of the Texas Republic. They did it in broad daylight. The war party moved with a speed that defied belief, covering distances that should have taken weeks in a matter of days. They bypassed major settlements when it suited their purposes, destroyed smaller towns when resistance seemed profitable, and carved a path of destruction 200 miles long and 50 miles wide. By the time Texas authorities realized what was happening, the raiders had already reached their objective and were beginning their withdrawal. Linville was sacked with theatrical precision. The Comanche warriors didn't just steal everything of value. They staged a celebration of their victory that was designed to humiliate their enemies as much as enrich themselves. Warriors paraded through the streets wearing top hats and formal coats stolen from the town's merchants, their horses draped with bolts of silk and calico. They held mock dinner parties using fine china looted from the customs house, then smashed the dishes against the walls when the performance was complete. It was psychological warfare, elevated to performance art. The return journey was even more audacious than the approach. Laden with loot and driving thousands of stolen horses and mules, the war party should have been vulnerable to pursuit and counterattack. Instead, they fought a running battle with Texas Rangers and militia forces for more than 200 miles, inflicting steady casualties while losing minimal numbers themselves. The Battle of Plum Creek, where Texas forces finally managed to engage the main Comanche force, resulted in a tactical victory for the Texans, but a strategic triumph for the raiders, who escaped with most of their plunder intact. The impact of the Linville raid resonated far beyond its immediate military consequences. It demonstrated that no settlement in Texas was truly safe, no matter how far from the frontier it might seem. More importantly, it proved that the Comanche could project military power across distances that conventional military wisdom deemed impossible. European armies struggled to maintain supply lines across similar distances. The Comanche had just lived off the land while fighting their way across an entire republic. The Mexican raids followed similar patterns, but operated on an even grander scale. Comanche war parties regularly penetrated as far south as Durango and San Luis Potosí, regions that Mexican authorities considered utterly secure from foreign invasion. These expeditions required crossing vast stretches of desert, navigating mountain passes, and fighting through dozens of potentially hostile settlements. Yet they became so routine that Mexican officials could almost predict when the next wave would arrive. The raiders developed sophisticated intelligence networks that would have impressed professional spies. They cultivated relationships with Mexican traders, gathered information from captives taken on previous raids, and maintained detailed mental maps of terrain, water sources, and defensive positions across thousands of square miles. Some war chiefs possessed geographic knowledge that surpassed that of official government surveyors, able to navigate by stars and landmarks across regions they might visit only once every few years. The captive trade that accompanied these raids created complex webs of cultural exchange that anthropologists are still trying to understand. Thousands of Mexican and Texan children and women were incorporated into Comanche society, where many rose to positions of influence and respect. Some became war chiefs themselves, leading raids against their former countrymen with a ferocity that shocked contemporary observers. Others served as interpreters, guides, and cultural brokers who helped the Comanche navigate the complex political landscape of their expanding empire. Perhaps most remarkably, the Great Raids created a form of tribute system that operated without any formal diplomatic framework. Mexican and Texas ranchers learned to leave offerings of horses and trade goods in locations where Comanche war parties were known to pass, hoping to buy immunity from attack. Local officials often negotiated informal truces that amounted to protection payments, providing supplies and information in exchange for promises that their communities would be spared. It was taxation without representation, in its most literal form, administered by warriors who collected their tribute at Lance Point. The raids also served as a form of economic redistribution that funneled wealth from European colonial settlements back into indigenous hands. Horses, silver, manufactured goods, and agricultural products that had been extracted from native populations through centuries of colonial exploitation were systematically recovered and redistributed throughout the Plains tribes. The Comanche had discovered that raiding could be more profitable than trading, and infinitely more satisfying than begging for scraps from colonial authorities. By 1850, the Great Raid culture had become so institutionalized that it functioned as a parallel economy alongside legitimate trade and diplomacy. Young Comanche men measured their worth by their success on the war trail. Women evaluated potential husbands based on their raiding prowess, and chiefs maintained their authority through their ability to organize profitable expeditions. An entire generation had grown up believing that Mexico and Texas existed primarily as sources of horses and captives, resources to be harvested as systematically as buffalo or deer. The raids had transformed the Comanche from a regional power into an intercontinental force capable of projecting military influence across half of North America. They had proven that mobility and audacity could triumph over static defenses and superior numbers, that psychological warfare could be more effective than conventional battles, and that a relatively small population could control vast territories through the systematic application of terror and tribute. The Great Raid culture had reached its zenith, and two entire nations lived in fear of warriors who could appear anywhere, anytime, like thunder from a clear sky. The Spanish governor, Don Juan Bautista de Anza, thought he was the cleverest man in North America when he rode into the Comanche camp near Taos in February 1786. He had come to negotiate a peace treaty that would end decades of warfare along New Mexico's northern frontier, and he was confident that his combination of Spanish diplomacy and military threats would cow the savage chieftains into submission. What he discovered instead was that he was about to be outmaneuvered by men who had been playing imperial politics, while he was still learning to read Latin primers in Spanish academies. The Comanche chief who greeted him was Icueracapa, Leather Jacket, a man whose very name spoke to his ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. But Icueracapa hadn't survived decades of warfare through martial prowess alone. He was also perhaps the most sophisticated diplomat on the North American continent, a master of the delicate art of playing European empires against each other while advancing Comanche interests with surgical precision. As Anza would soon discover, negotiating with Icueracapa was like playing chess against someone who had invented new rules while you weren't looking. The treaty negotiations that followed would become a masterclass in diplomatic manipulation that European chancelleries would have envied. Icueracapa understood something that eluded most of his contemporaries. The Spanish Empire wasn't a monolithic force, but a collection of competing interests, regional jealousies, and bureaucratic rivalries that could be exploited by anyone clever enough to identify the fault lines. He had spent years studying Spanish colonial administration, learning which officials reported to whom, which regions competed for resources, and which policies contradicted each other. The Comanche negotiating strategy was breathtakingly audacious. Rather than simply agreeing to Spanish terms or rejecting them outright, Icueracapa proposed a partnership that would make the Comanche the dominant indigenous power across the entire Southwest. In exchange for peace with New Mexico, the Spanish would provide weapons, ammunition, and trade goods that the Comanche would use to destroy their Apache enemies, who happened to be Spain's other major frontier problem. It was realpolitik at its most ruthless. The Comanche would solve Spain's Apache problem while simultaneously eliminating their own primary rival for control of the southern plains. But the genius of the proposal lay in its long-term implications. By allying with Spain against the Apache, the Comanche weren't subordinating themselves to Spanish authority. They were positioning themselves as Spain's equal partner in regional affairs. The treaty explicitly recognized Comanche territorial claims, established formal diplomatic protocols for future negotiations, and created trade relationships that would make Spanish settlements dependent on Comanche goodwill. Anza thought he was recruiting auxiliary troops. Quanah was negotiating mutual recognition between sovereign powers. The Spanish-Comanche alliance that emerged from these negotiations fundamentally altered the balance of power across the Southwest. Comanche war parties, now armed with Spanish weapons and operating with Spanish approval, systematically destroyed Apache resistance across Texas and New Mexico. Within a decade, the Apache had been driven into the mountains of Arizona and northern Mexico, their power as a regional force permanently broken. The Comanche had used Spanish resources to eliminate their greatest rival while strengthening their own position immeasurably. But Quana's diplomatic masterpiece was just beginning. Even as he negotiated with Spanish officials, he was simultaneously opening channels to French traders operating out of Louisiana. The French, locked in their own imperial competition with Spain, were delighted to discover a potential ally who could disrupt Spanish trade routes and military operations. They offered the Comanche something the Spanish never could: access to superior European manufactured goods at competitive prices, with no strings attached regarding territorial sovereignty or religious conversion. The triangular relationship that developed between the Comanche, Spanish, and French became a textbook example of balance of power diplomacy. The Comanche would play Spanish and French interests against each other, extracting concessions from both while committing exclusively to neither. When Spanish officials demanded exclusive trading privileges, Comanche negotiators would point to better French offers. When French traders pushed for military cooperation against Spanish settlements, the Comanche would cite their peace treaty obligations. It was diplomatic juggling of the highest order, executed by men who European political theorists insisted were incapable of such sophistication. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 should have disrupted this careful balance, but instead it provided the Comanche with an even greater opportunity to demonstrate their diplomatic skills. The arrival of American officials created a three-way competition for Comanche alliance that would have challenged the most experienced European diplomats. Each power offered different advantages: Spanish silver and established trade relationships, French manufactured goods and military expertise, American territorial guarantees and commercial opportunities. The Comanche response was to negotiate separate agreements with all three powers simultaneously, carefully crafting each treaty to avoid conflicting obligations while maximizing their own advantages. They promised the Spanish continued cooperation against Apache raiders, assured the French of their friendship and trading partnerships, and convinced American officials that they were eager to establish peaceful relations with the new territorial government. Each power believed it had secured Comanche loyalty. In reality, the Comanche had secured their own freedom of action while playing their rivals against each other with masterful precision. The diplomatic sophistication required for this juggling act astounded contemporary observers. Comanche negotiators demonstrated detailed knowledge of European law, American constitutional principles, and Spanish colonial administration. They could quote specific treaty provisions, cite legal precedents, and invoke diplomatic protocols with an expertise that rivaled career Foreign Service officers. Chiefs who had never seen the inside of a European classroom could debate the finer points of international law with men who had studied at the finest universities in Europe and America. Perhaps most remarkably, they managed to maintain this diplomatic balancing act while simultaneously conducting military operations against all three powers when their interests demanded it. The same chiefs who negotiated trade agreements in Santa Fe would lead raids against Spanish settlements in Texas. Warriors who accepted American presence at diplomatic councils would steal American horses on the war trail. The Comanche had discovered that diplomacy and warfare weren't opposites, but complementary tools of statecraft, to be employed as circumstances required. The Mexican independence movement of 1821 provided another opportunity for Comanche diplomatic manipulation. As Spanish authority collapsed across the Southwest, various Mexican revolutionary factions courted Comanche support for their causes. The Comanche response was characteristically shrewd. They offered conditional support to multiple factions while hedging their bets in case any particular group failed to achieve power. When the dust settled and Mexican independence was secure, the Comanche found themselves in the enviable position of having supported the winning side without having committed themselves exclusively to any single faction. The new Mexican government soon discovered that independence from Spain didn't mean independence from Comanche influence. The same diplomatic pressures that had constrained Spanish colonial policy now operated with even greater force against a Mexican state that lacked Spain's military resources and administrative experience. Mexican officials found themselves negotiating from a position of weakness with Comanche chiefs who had decades of experience manipulating European colonial authorities. The Texas Revolution of 1835-36 created yet another opportunity for Comanche diplomatic maneuvering. Both Texan revolutionaries and Mexican loyalists sought Comanche support, offering territorial concessions, trade privileges, and military cooperation in exchange for alliance. The Comanche response was to remain officially neutral, while quietly supporting whichever side offered the most immediate advantages. They sold horses to Texas forces while raiding Texas settlements, negotiated with Mexican officials while attacking Mexican supply lines. It was neutrality as a form of warfare, allowing them to profit from the conflict while avoiding the risks of exclusive commitment to either side. By 1840, the Comanche had demonstrated something unprecedented in the history of European colonialism, that indigenous peoples could not only resist European expansion, but actually manipulate European imperial competition to their own advantage. They had forced 3 different European powers and their successor states to recognize them as legitimate diplomatic partners, extracted enormous concessions through skillful negotiation, and maintained their sovereignty while playing their enemies against each other with consummate skill. The lesson was clear to anyone willing to see it. The age of easy conquest was over, and the Comanche had proven that indigenous peoples could master the game of nations as skillfully as any European diplomat. They had turned the continent's political complexity into their greatest weapon, and they wielded it with devastating effectiveness.
Dawn in Comancheria broke not with roosters crowing or church bells tolling, but with the thunder of 10,000 hooves as vast horse herds moved across the prairie like living rivers. A Comanche child's first memory was often the rhythm of a galloping horse, the sensation of speed and freedom that would define their entire worldview. By the time European children were learning their letters, Comanche youngsters were already centaurs, as comfortable on horseback as on foot, more comfortable in fact, since walking was something their people did only when absolutely necessary. This was a civilization that had rebuilt itself around the horse so completely that visitors often wondered if they were witnessing the emergence of an entirely new form of human existence. The Comanche camp was a marvel of organized mobility that could have taught lessons to the most experienced military quartermaster. What appeared to European eyes as random chaos was actually a sophisticated system designed for rapid deployment and maximum efficiency. Every lodge had its designated place in the camp circle. Every family knew exactly where they belonged in the marching order. And the entire community could break camp and be moving within an hour of receiving the signal. The buffalo hide teepees themselves were masterpieces of engineering, designed to withstand plains storms while remaining light enough to be transported by a single horse. When the wind howled across the prairie with enough force to flatten wooden buildings, Comanche lodges bent but never broke. The social organization that governed daily life was as fluid and adaptable as the camp itself. Comanche society recognized no rigid class distinctions or hereditary aristocracy. Status came from achievement, success in warfare, skill in hunting, wisdom in counsel, or excellence in the arts of plains life. A poor man's son could become a war chief if he proved his courage and leadership. A chief's son could find himself following others if he lacked the skills to command respect. It was meritocracy in its purest form, a society where ability mattered more than ancestry. Women wielded power that would have shocked European observers accustomed to more restrictive gender roles. While men dominated warfare and formal politics, women controlled the domestic economy that made everything else possible. They owned the lodges, managed the family's property, and made crucial decisions about when and where to move camp. A skilled woman could accumulate enormous wealth through her own efforts, processing buffalo hides, crafting trade goods, managing horse herds, and successful marriages were often negotiations between economic equals rather than transactions between a man and his future property. The most successful women became puha carriers, individuals believed to possess supernatural power that could influence everything from weather patterns to the outcome of battles. These women served as healers, prophets, and advisors whose counsel was sought by the most powerful war chiefs. Some led their own trading expeditions to distant tribes, negotiating deals that brought exotic goods from as far away as the Pacific coast and the Great Lakes. In a society that valued practical ability above all else, gender was less important than results. Children grew up in a world without formal schools, but with an education more comprehensive than most European universities could provide. By age 5, they could identify dozens of different plants and their uses, track animals across various terrain, and read weather patterns that determined life and death on the plains. Boys learned to make their own arrows, select and train horses, and master the complex etiquette of warrior societies. Girls learned to process buffalo into everything from food to clothing to shelter, manage complex kinship networks that determined political alliances, and accumulate the skills that would make them valuable partners in plains society. The horse herds that supported this civilization were more than mere property. They were living symbols of wealth, status, and supernatural power. A successful Comanche family might own hundreds of horses, each animal carefully selected for specific purposes. War horses were trained to respond to leg pressure alone, allowing their riders to use both hands for weapons. Buffalo horses learned to single out individual animals from massive herds and follow them through stampedes that could crush the unwary. Racing horses became sources of enormous pride and even greater gambling stakes, their bloodlines tracked with the care that European nobles devoted to their ancestry. The relationship between Comanche and horse transcended mere utility and approached the mystical. Warriors spoke to their favorite mounts as partners rather than animals, developed bonds that could last decades, and mourned their deaths with genuine grief. Some horses became legendary figures in their own right, their exploits celebrated in songs and stories that passed from generation to generation. The fastest war horse, the most intelligent buffalo runner, the most loyal companion. These animals achieved a form of immortality that European military tradition reserved for human heroes. The seasonal round that governed Comanche life was a carefully choreographed dance between human need and natural abundance. Spring brought the great horse-stealing raids as war parties set out to replenish herds depleted by winter losses. Summer was the time of buffalo hunting, when entire bands would follow the massive herds across hundreds of miles, processing enough meat to sustain them through the lean months ahead. Autumn meant trade gatherings, where bands would converge to exchange goods, arrange marriages, and share information about distant events. Winter was the time for storytelling, crafting, and the intimate social bonds that held Comanche society together during the harsh plains cold. The buffalo hunt itself was a spectacle that combined practical necessity with high art. Hundreds of mounted hunters would coordinate their approach to massive herds with the precision of a military operation. Each hunter knew exactly which animals to target, how to position himself for the cleanest kill, and how to avoid the deadly chaos of a buffalo stampede. The processing that followed was equally impressive. An entire buffalo could be transformed into usable products within hours, every part of the animal serving some purpose in Comanche life. Nothing was wasted, nothing discarded. It was efficiency born of absolute dependence on the natural world. The spiritual life that sustained this remarkable society was as practical as everything else about Comanche culture. Their religion focused on puha, power that could be accessed through dreams, visions, and ritual observances. This wasn't abstract theology, but intensely personal spirituality designed to provide real advantages in a dangerous world. A warrior's medicine bundle might contain objects that would protect him in battle, help him find game, or ensure his horses remained healthy. Women sought visions that would guide them in raising children, managing households, or navigating the complex social relationships that determined family success. The arts that flourished in this mobile civilization were designed for portability but achieved remarkable sophistication within those constraints. Comanche craftspeople created clothing that was both beautiful and functional, decorated with intricate beadwork and painted designs that told stories of personal achievement and spiritual power. Their weapons were works of art as well as tools of war. Bows that could drive arrows through buffalo ribs, lances decorated with eagle feathers and scalps that proclaimed their bearers' prowess, shields painted with protective symbols that had appeared in dreams. Perhaps most remarkably, this entire civilization existed without written language, permanent architecture, or centralized government. Everything that held Comanche society together, laws, histories, technical knowledge, spiritual beliefs, was maintained through oral tradition and practical demonstration. Children learned by watching and doing rather than reading and memorizing. Knowledge was tested through application rather than examination. It was education perfectly adapted to a nomadic lifestyle, producing individuals who could survive and thrive in environments that would have killed their European contemporaries within days. The camp circle itself embodied Comanche values and worldview. Each family's position reflected their current status and relationships, but those positions could change as circumstances evolved. The chief's lodge occupied the place of honor, but only as long as the chief commanded respect through his actions. The arrangement provided security. Everyone could see everyone else, strangers could be identified immediately, and the entire community could respond instantly to threats or opportunities. By 1850, this remarkable civilization had created something unprecedented in human history: a nomadic empire that dominated vast territories while maintaining complete cultural cohesion across hundreds of autonomous communities. They had proven that sophisticated society didn't require cities, that political power didn't need permanent institutions, and that human beings could adapt to any environment if they possessed the will to transform themselves completely. The horse lords had built their domain not from stone and steel, but from mobility and adaptation, and it had made them masters of half a continent.
The 12 Comanche chiefs who rode into San Antonio on March 19, 1840, believed they were coming to complete a prisoner exchange that would secure peace between their people and the upstart Texas Republic. They brought with them Matilda Lockhart, a 16-year-old captive whose release was meant to demonstrate good faith before negotiations for the remaining prisoners could begin. What they encountered instead was a trap that would ignite the bloodiest conflict in Comanche history and transform Texas from a minor frontier republic into the crucible where two civilizations would fight to the death. The chiefs had made a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of their adversaries. Unlike the Spanish, who had learned through bitter experience to approach Comanche negotiations with respect and caution, the Texans possessed the dangerous combination of European military technology and American frontier arrogance. They had convinced themselves that their recent victory over Mexican forces at San Jacinto proved their superiority over all enemies, regardless of race or military tradition. The Comanche were about to teach them that empires are not built on wishful thinking. The council house that morning was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Texas officials, led by the Indian agent Hugh McLeod, had decided to abandon diplomacy for coercion. Their plan was breathtakingly simple: take the Comanche delegation hostage and demand the immediate release of all captives held throughout Comancheria. It was the kind of strategy that might have worked against a demoralized tribe begging for scraps from colonial authorities. Applied to the lords of the southern plains, it was tantamount to a declaration of war. The Comanche chiefs who had come to negotiate represented some of the most powerful leaders in their society. Mukawara, a peace chief whose wisdom had guided negotiations for decades. Mukwuru, whose diplomatic skills had helped maintain the delicate balance between warfare and trade, and a dozen other men whose authority extended across thousands of square miles and tens of thousands of warriors. These were not supplicants seeking mercy, but sovereign rulers engaged in negotiations between equals. The Texans were about to discover the difference. When MacLeod announced that the chiefs would be held prisoner until all captives were returned, the council house exploded into violence. The Comanche response was immediate and devastating. They fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they had been betrayed under a flag of truce. Tables became weapons, diplomatic gifts transformed into projectiles, and the peaceful meeting dissolved into a melee that left bodies scattered across the floor. Within minutes, 12 of the most respected leaders in Comanche society lay dead, along with several Texas officials who had believed their treachery would go unopposed. The massacre sent shockwaves through both societies, but the Comanche response was swift and terrible. Word of the betrayal spread across the plains with the speed of wildfire, carried by messengers who rode their horses to death to spread the news. The violation of diplomatic immunity, a concept the Comanche held sacred, had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Every band, every warrior society, every clan that had lost kinsmen in San Antonio united around a single demand: vengeance. The war chief Buffalo Hump emerged as the architect of Comanche retaliation. He was a man whose very name struck terror into frontier settlements, a warrior whose strategic brilliance was matched only by his implacable hatred of those who had wronged his people. Buffalo Hump understood that conventional raids, devastating as they might be, would not adequately answer the insult of the council house fight. What was needed was a demonstration of Comanche power so overwhelming that it would forever shatter Texas' confidence in their ability to dictate terms to the lords of the plains. The Great Raid of August 1840 was Buffalo Hump's masterpiece, a military operation that combined tactical brilliance with psychological warfare on a scale never before attempted. Rather than striking isolated frontier settlements, he would penetrate to the very heart of the Texas Republic and destroy its most important economic center. The target was Linville, the bustling port town on the Gulf Coast where goods worth hundreds of thousands of dollars were stored before shipment to markets across America and Europe. And the logistics of the operation were staggering. Buffalo Hump assembled a force of more than 1,000 warriors from multiple bands, creating the largest Comanche army ever fielded. This wasn't a typical raiding party, but a military expedition designed to project power across distances that European armies would have found challenging. The war party would have to travel more than 200 miles through settled territory, fight their way past numerous towns and military posts, and return home while laden with plunder and driving thousands of stolen animals. The approach march became a masterclass in mobile warfare. The Comanche force moved with a speed that defied belief, covering ground so rapidly that Texas authorities couldn't organize effective resistance. They bypassed major settlements when it served their purposes, destroyed smaller towns when they offered valuable targets, and left a trail of devastation 50 miles wide across the heart of the Republic. By the time Texas officials realized the scale of the threat, Buffalo Hump's warriors were already approaching their objective. Victoria fell first, its inhabitants fleeing in panic as Comanche warriors swept through the streets like an avenging whirlwind. The town's destruction was methodical and complete. Every building burned, every horse stolen, every symbol of European civilization reduced to ashes. But Victoria was merely an appetizer. The main course lay 25 miles southeast at Linville, where the accumulated wealth of the Texas Republic sat defenseless on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. Linville's destruction became the stuff of legend precisely because it was so thoroughly, almost artistically complete. The Comanche warriors didn't simply loot the town. They staged a celebration of victory that was designed to humiliate their enemies as much as enrich themselves. Warriors paraded through the burning streets wearing top hats and formal coats stolen from merchant stores, their horses draped with bolts of silk and calico that fluttered like battle flags. They held mock dinner parties, using fine china looted from the customs house, complete with theatrical toasts to the Texas Republic, before smashing the dishes against the walls in contemptuous finale. The psychological impact of the Linville raid resonated far beyond its immediate military consequences. Buffalo Hump had proven that no settlement in Texas was truly secure, no matter how far from the frontier it might seem. More devastating still, he had demonstrated that the Comanche could project military power with a sophistication that conventional military wisdom deemed impossible for a nomadic society. The Texas Republic, which had proclaimed itself master of a vast territory, had been revealed as a collection of vulnerable settlements held together by little more than bluster and wishful thinking. The return journey was even more audacious than the approach. Laden with plunder and driving an estimated 3,000 stolen horses and mules, Buffalo Hump's force should have been vulnerable to pursuit and destruction. Instead, they fought a running battle with Texas Rangers and militia forces for more than 200 miles, maintaining their cohesion while inflicting steady casualties on their pursuers. The Battle of Plum Creek, where Texas forces finally managed to engage the main Comanche army, resulted in a tactical victory for the Texans, but a strategic triumph for the Raiders, who escaped with most of their enormous haul intact. The political earthquake that followed the Great Raid transformed Texas from a confident republic into a garrisoned state living under constant threat. Settlement patterns that had pushed steadily westward suddenly reversed as terrified colonists abandoned their homes and retreated to fortified towns. The Texas Rangers, previously seen as invincible frontier guardians, were reorganized and expanded in tacit admission that they had been completely outmatched by Comanche military prowess. President Mirabeau Lamar's response was to double down on aggression, launching a series of punitive expeditions designed to demonstrate that Texas would not be intimidated by savage raiders. But these campaigns, led by men who understood European warfare but remained baffled by Plains military tactics, accomplished little beyond confirming Comanche's superiority in their chosen element. The Rangers might win individual skirmishes when they could pin down small war parties, but they could never achieve the decisive victories that would restore Texas confidence. The conflict had evolved into something unprecedented in North American history, a genuine war between two sovereign powers with fundamentally different concepts of civilization, warfare, and political organization. On one side stood the Texas Republic, representing European military traditions, settled agriculture, and hierarchical government. On the other rode the Comanche Empire, embodying nomadic flexibility, democratic consensus, and the revolutionary principle that mobility could triumph over static defense. The Council House fight had intended to demonstrate Texas dominance through treachery and intimidation. Instead, it had ignited a conflict that would prove the Comanche Empire was not merely another frontier tribe to be crushed by European expansion, but a genuine rival civilization capable of matching European military power with indigenous innovation. The collision between Republic and Empire had begun, and the outcome would determine the future of the North American continent. The Lords of the Plains had accepted the challenge, and they were ready to prove that empires built on horseback could be just as deadly as empires built on gunpowder. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie stared across the Llano Estacado in the autumn of 1871 and saw his own mortality reflected in the endless expanse of grassland that stretched to every horizon. This was the Staked Plains, the heart of unconquered Comancheria, where no army had ever successfully penetrated, and returned to tell the tale. Mackenzie was arguably the finest cavalry officer the United States Army had ever produced, a Civil War veteran who had faced down Confederate cavalry and emerged victorious from battles that had broken lesser men. But the Comanche had just taught him something that 4 years of warfare against Robert E. Lee's finest had never driven home. There were forms of military genius that transcended anything taught at West Point. The blue-coated soldiers who began appearing along the Texas frontier after 1865 represented something entirely new in Comanche experience. These weren't the amateur militiamen or volunteer rangers who had harassed them for decades, men whose enthusiasm exceeded their training and whose tactics could be predicted with deadly accuracy. The U.S. Army was a professional military machine forged in the crucible of industrialized warfare, commanded by officers who had learned to coordinate massive operations across continental distances. They brought with them repeating rifles, telegraph communications, and a logistical system that could sustain military operations indefinitely. Most ominously, they brought something the Comanche had never faced before: unlimited time, unlimited resources, and the absolute determination to win regardless of cost. But the Comanche had spent 2 centuries adapting to new challenges, and they weren't about to surrender their empire without teaching these blue coats some hard lessons about plains warfare. The war chiefs who had inherited leadership from the previous generation, men like Quanah Parker, Lone Wolf, and Saytank, understood that they faced an existential threat unlike any in their people's history. The Americans weren't interested in negotiated settlements or tribute arrangements. They wanted total conquest and the complete elimination of Comanche independence. It would be adaptation or extinction, and the Lords of the Plains had never chosen extinction. The first encounters between Comanche war parties and U.S. Army patrols revealed the depth of the challenge facing both sides. At the Battle of the North Fork of the Red River in 1858, Captain Earl Van Dorn had demonstrated that disciplined troops with superior firepower could defeat Comanche warriors in direct confrontation if they could pin them down long enough to engage. But pinning down an enemy that moved like smoke across terrain they knew better than their own horses had proved nearly impossible. The Comanche response was characteristically pragmatic. Avoid direct confrontation, strike supply lines, and use the vast emptiness of the plains to exhaust pursuing forces. The Civil War had provided an unexpected reprieve, as blue and gray armies slaughtered each other with industrial efficiency, while the Comanche raided with virtual impunity across Texas and the Indian Territory. Confederate forces, stripped of men and resources by the demands of fighting the Union, could offer little resistance to war parties that struck like lightning and vanished back into the wilderness. For 4 years, the Comanche had tasted what victory might look like, their enemies destroying each other while Comancheria expanded to its greatest extent in history. But when the war ended and veteran Union forces turned their attention westward, the Comanche discovered they faced an enemy that had been transformed by 4 years of total warfare. These soldiers had learned to fight campaigns of annihilation, to destroy not just armies, but entire societies. They had burned Atlanta, devastated the Shenandoah Valley, and reduced the Confederacy to rubble through the systematic application of overwhelming force. The same ruthlessness that had broken the South would now be applied to breaking indigenous resistance across the West. The Buffalo Soldiers, African-American cavalry regiments stationed on the frontier, became the Comanche's most persistent and respected enemies. These men brought a professional competence that frontier militia had never possessed, combined with a personal motivation that white troops often lacked. Many were former slaves who understood exactly what freedom meant and were determined to protect it for themselves and their families. They learned plains warfare through hard experience, developing tactics specifically designed to counter Comanche mobility and strike capability. The 10th Cavalry, commanded by officers like Colonel Benjamin Grierson, pioneered new approaches to fighting nomadic enemies. Instead of chasing war parties across endless prairie, a futile exercise that had exhausted previous forces, they focused on controlling water sources, disrupting supply lines, and maintaining constant pressure through multiple, simultaneous patrols. It was warfare of attrition designed to exhaust Comanche resources and limit their freedom of movement. But the Comanche adaptation was equally impressive. War chiefs like Quana Parker studied army tactics with the same intensity their grandfathers had devoted to Spanish military methods. They learned to coordinate operations across vast distances using signal fires and messenger systems that allowed scattered bands to concentrate rapidly when opportunities arose. They developed new techniques for attacking fortified positions, using captured firearms with devastating effectiveness and melting away before army reinforcements could arrive. The technology gap that had always favored European forces was beginning to narrow in unexpected ways. Comanche warriors armed with repeating rifles were arguably more effective than infantry soldiers trained for linear warfare. Their superior horsemanship allowed them to fight mounted actions that army cavalry couldn't match, while their knowledge of terrain provided advantages that no amount of military training could overcome. A Comanche war party could travel 100 miles in a day across country that would challenge a modern automobile. Army units were lucky to cover 20 miles without exhausting their horses. The psychological warfare that had terrorized previous enemies proved equally effective against army forces. Isolated patrols would vanish without a trace, their fate unknown, until their mutilated bodies were discovered weeks later. Supply trains would be attacked with surgical precision, the escorts wiped out while the cargo was methodically plundered. Most unnerving of all, the Comanche seemed to appear and disappear at will, materializing from empty landscape to strike devastating blows before melting back into the vastness that had spawned them. The Red River War of 1874-75 represented the climax of this technological and tactical evolution. General Philip Sheridan, the architect of Sherman's march through Georgia, applied the same total war concepts to the Comanche problem. Rather than seeking decisive battles that the Comanche would simply avoid, he launched multiple converging columns designed to maintain constant pressure while systematically destroying the resources that sustained Plains nomadism. Colonel Mackenzie's destruction of the Comanche horse herds in Palo Duro Canyon became the turning point of the campaign, not because it was a military victory in the traditional sense, but because it struck at the very foundation of Comanche civilization. Without their horses, the lords of the plains became pedestrians again, reduced to the same vulnerable status they had held before their great transformation 3 centuries earlier. It was warfare aimed not at defeating an army, but at destroying an entire way of life. The campaign's success lay not in any single engagement, but in the relentless application of industrial-age logistics to the problem of nomadic warfare. The army could sustain operations year-round, maintain multiple columns in the field simultaneously, and replace losses with resources that seemed inexhaustible. Telegraph communications allowed coordination across distances that would have been impossible for previous military forces, while railroad supply lines brought ammunition, food, and reinforcements directly to the theater of operations. Yet even in defeat, the Comanche demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had made them masters of the plains. Quanah Parker's fighting withdrawal across the staked plains became a masterclass in mobile defense, inflicting casualties while preserving his core force for future operations. Small war parties continued to strike army installations and supply lines with devastating effectiveness, proving that Comanche military skills remained undiminished even as their strategic position became hopeless. The innovation that would define the final phase of Comanche resistance came from an unexpected source: the hide hunters who had begun systematically slaughtering the buffalo herds that sustained plains nomadism. These men possessed long-range rifles that could kill at distances exceeding 1,000 yards, combined with an intimate knowledge of buffalo behavior that made them extraordinarily effective at their grim work. The Comanche response was to adapt their traditional hit-and-run tactics to this new threat, developing techniques for attacking hide hunters' camps and disrupting their operations. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls in June 1874 demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of this adaptation. Quanah Parker and his ally Isa Tai assembled a force of nearly 700 warriors from multiple tribes, armed with modern weapons and motivated by prophetic visions of victory. Their attack on the buffalo hunters' stronghold should have been devastating, a coordinated assault by the finest light cavalry in North America against a handful of isolated hunters. Instead, it became a demonstration of how technological evolution had shifted the balance of plains warfare. The hunters' big-bore rifles could kill at ranges where Comanche bows were useless, while their knowledge of defensive tactics allowed them to hold off vastly superior numbers from prepared positions. The failure at Adobe Walls marked the end of Comanche offensive capability and the beginning of their final retreat into the heart of the Staked Plains. By 1875, the Bluecoats had achieved what Spanish conquistadors and Texas Rangers had never managed. They had forced the Comanche Empire to the edge of extinction through the systematic application of overwhelming force. The Lords of the Plains had adapted brilliantly to every previous challenge, but they could not adapt fast enough to overcome the industrial might of a nation that had just proven its ability to wage total war on a continental scale. The age of Comanche dominance was ending, but their final chapters would be written in blood and defiance that would echo through American memory forever. The young warrior who would become the last war chief of the Free Comanche was born into a world already shadowed by prophecy and doom. Quana Parker's first memories were of his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, weeping over visions of blue-coated soldiers and the sound of thunder that never brought rain. She had been captured as a child during the Great Raid on Parker's Fort in 1836, had lived as Comanche for nearly a quarter century, and had married Peter Nocona, one of the most feared war chiefs on the plains. But by the time her son reached manhood in the 1860s, she could see the future written in smoke signals and telegraph wires. The world that had made her Comanche was dying, and her son would either save it or preside over its funeral. Quanah's mixed heritage should have made him an outcast in either world, but instead it became the source of his greatest strength. From his white ancestry, he inherited an intuitive understanding of European military thinking and an ability to navigate the complex politics of a multicultural empire. From his Comanche father, he learned the arts of war and leadership that had made his people masters of the plains. Most importantly, he possessed something that pure-blood leaders often lacked: the desperate creativity of a man who belonged fully to neither world and therefore had to create his own. When Peter Nocona fell in battle in 1860 and Cynthia Ann was recaptured by Texas Rangers, young Quanah found himself orphaned, but not alone. The Quahada band adopted him completely, recognizing in this tall, fierce young man the qualities that made great war chiefs. By his early 20s, he had already distinguished himself in raids across Texas and the Indian Territory, earning a reputation for tactical brilliance that rivaled the legendary chiefs of previous generations. But Quanah possessed something his predecessors had never needed: the grim understanding that he was fighting not for conquest or glory, but for the very survival of his people. The transformation of Quanah from promising young warrior to supreme war chief came during the desperate years of the early 1870s, when it became clear that the old ways of fighting would not be sufficient to defeat the Bluecoats. While older chiefs clung to traditional tactics that had served them well against Spanish Lancers and Texas Rangers, Quanah began experimenting with new approaches that combined Comanche mobility with captured army weapons and tactics. He studied the soldiers' methods with the intensity of a general staff officer, learning to anticipate their movements and exploit their weaknesses with surgical precision. His first great innovation was the war party that functioned like a modern special forces unit. Rather than assembling large raiding forces that moved slowly and presented tempting targets for army patrols, Quana perfected the art of lightning strikes by small groups of elite warriors armed with the latest repeating rifles. These men could cover enormous distances in a single day, strike targets that seemed impossibly distant from Comanche territory, and vanish back into the staked plains before pursuit could be organized. It was asymmetric warfare refined to a deadly art. The mystical dimension of Quana's leadership became apparent during his alliance with the young medicine man Tai, whose prophetic visions promised supernatural protection for warriors who followed his spiritual guidance. Tai claimed that his medicine could turn bullets to water, make warriors invulnerable to enemy fire, and restore the buffalo herds that white hunters were systematically destroying. For a people facing extinction, these promises offered hope that transcended rational military analysis. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls in June 1874 became the testing ground for this fusion of traditional Comanche warfare with new spiritual power. Quana assembled the largest indigenous force seen on the southern plains since the Great Raids of the 1840s. Nearly 700 warriors from multiple tribes, all united by Tai's visions and Quana's strategic leadership. The target was the buffalo hunters' trading post at Adobe Walls, where fewer than 30 men with their long-range rifles represented everything that was destroying the plains' way of life. The attack should have been devastating. Quana's tactical plan was flawless. Coordinated charges from multiple directions, overwhelming the defenders before they could organize effective resistance, then systematic destruction of the facilities that supported the hide trade. His warriors were the finest light cavalry in North America, armed with modern weapons and motivated by the knowledge that they were fighting for their very existence. Everything that had made the Comanche masters of the plains for 2 centuries was focused on this single target. Instead, Adobe Walls became a demonstration of how technological evolution had fundamentally altered the nature of plains warfare. The buffalo hunters, point 50 caliber Sharps rifles, could kill at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, distances where Comanche mobility advantages became meaningless. Billy Dixon's legendary shot that knocked a warrior from his horse at nearly a mile demonstrated that individual marksmanship had become more decisive than cavalry charges. The thick sod walls of the trading post, designed to withstand plain storms, proved equally effective against arrows and bullets. But the real defeat was spiritual, rather than military. When Tai's medicine failed to protect the warriors from enemy bullets, when the promised supernatural aid never materialized, the psychological foundation of Comanche resistance began to crumble. Quana had the tactical skill to recognize when an attack was failing and the leadership ability to organize an orderly withdrawal. But he couldn't restore faith in prophetic visions that had been shattered by the harsh reality of modern warfare. The failure at Adobe Walls marked the beginning of the Red River War, the final campaign that would decide the fate of the Southern Plains. General Philip Sheridan's strategy was brutally simple. Multiple converging columns would maintain constant pressure on the Comanche bands while systematically destroying the resources that sustained nomadic life. It was total war applied to nomadic peoples, designed to make resistance impossible rather than merely defeating it in battle. Quana's response demonstrated the tactical genius that made him legendary among both enemies and allies. Rather than attempting to defend fixed positions or seeking decisive battles that army forces could win through superior firepower, he conducted a fighting withdrawal across the staked plains that combined strategic retreat with continuous harassment of pursuing forces. His war parties struck supply trains, isolated patrols, and communication lines with devastating effectiveness, while avoiding the kind of large-scale engagements that Quana army commanders needed to achieve decisive victory. The cat-and-mouse game that followed became an epic of endurance that tested the limits of both civilizations. Army columns would pursue Comanche bands across hundreds of miles of trackless prairie, only to find their quarry had vanished into landscape that offered no landmarks, no reliable water sources, and no shelter from the elements that could kill unprepared men within hours. Quana's knowledge of this terrain was encyclopedic. He knew every hidden spring, every sheltered canyon, every game trail that could conceal a war party's movement. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie's breakthrough came not through tactical brilliance, but through systematic intelligence gathering that revealed the location of the main Comanche winter camps in Palo Duro Canyon. The attack that followed was militarily insignificant. A few warriors killed, minimal resistance encountered, but strategically devastating. Mackenzie's destruction of the vast horse herds that represented Comanche wealth and mobility transformed the lords of the plains back into pedestrians, vulnerable to pursuit and unable to sustain their nomadic lifestyle. The loss of their horses was more than a military defeat. It was a spiritual catastrophe that struck at the very foundation of Comanche identity. For nearly 2 centuries, their civilization had been built around the horse, their status derived from horsemanship, their military power dependent on mobility. Without horses, they were no longer Comanche in any meaningful sense. They were refugees from their own history, reduced to scavenging for survival in a landscape that had once been their empire. Quana's final campaign was fought not with horses and lances, but with the terrible arithmetic of starvation and exposure. As winter closed in across the staked plains, his remaining followers faced the choice between surrender and extinction. The buffalo herds that had sustained plains nomadism for millennia were gone, slaughtered by hide hunters with industrial efficiency. The army patrols that had seemed manageable enemies during summer campaigns became death sentences for people trying to survive on foot through a plains winter. The decision to surrender came not from military defeat, but from the responsibility of leadership. Quana could have fought to the last warrior, could have chosen the glorious death that warrior tradition demanded. Instead, he chose the harder path, leading his people into captivity to ensure their survival. On June 2, 1875, he rode into Fort Sill at the head of 400 Quahada Comanche, the last free band of the southern plains, and formally surrendered to Colonel Mackenzie. The ceremony was conducted with the dignity that both sides recognized the moment deserved. Quana dismounted from his warhorse for the final time, handed his weapons to the army officer who had been his most persistent enemy, and spoke the words that ended 2 centuries of Comanche dominance. "I am Quana Parker. I am ready to go to the reservation." It was capitulation spoken with the authority of a sovereign ruler, surrender that somehow conveyed more dignity than victory. The last war chief of the Free Comanche had chosen survival over glory, and in doing so had preserved his people for a future that neither he nor his enemies could yet imagine. The age of the horse lords was over, but Quana Parker's greatest challenges lay ahead in learning to be Comanche in a world that no longer had room for nomadic empires. The iron gates of Fort Sill closed behind Quanah Parker on June 2, 1875, sealing not just his freedom, but the fate of an entire civilization. The man who had been the most feared war chief on the southern plains now found himself assigned a number by army clerks who couldn't pronounce his name correctly. Prisoner 394 was given a metal tag to wear around his neck, a daily ration of government beef, and strict instructions not to leave the reservation boundaries without written permission. It was a transformation so complete, so devastating, that lesser men would have simply withered away. Instead, Quana Parker did something that amazed his captors and confounded his critics. He reinvented himself once again, this time not as a warrior, but as a politician whose influence would eventually extend from the reservation to the halls of Congress. The reservation that became the Comanche's prison was a masterpiece of bureaucratic cruelty disguised as humanitarian policy. Located in the barren hills of southwestern Oklahoma, it encompassed just over 2 million acres of land that bore no resemblance to the vast prairie empire the Comanche had once ruled. There were no buffalo to hunt, no enemies to raid, no horses to steal. None of the activities that had given Comanche life meaning for centuries. Instead, there were government agents who spoke of farming and Christianity, school teachers who forbade children to speak their native language, and missionaries who proclaimed that salvation required abandoning everything that made them Comanche. The first years were a slow-motion catastrophe that claimed more lives than any military campaign. Disease swept through the camps with devastating efficiency, killing people whose immune systems had no defense against the concentrated pathogens of settled life. Malnutrition became endemic as warriors who had once lived on buffalo meat tried to survive on government rations of flour and beef that were often spoiled before they arrived. Most heartbreaking of all, the children began to forget their heritage, learning English in government schools while their elders died taking ancient knowledge to unmarked graves. But Quana possessed something that made him uniquely suited to navigate this new world. His mixed heritage had given him an intuitive understanding of white society that pure-blood leaders lacked. While other chiefs retreated into sullen resistance or defeated resignation, Quana began studying his captors with the same intensity he had once devoted to military intelligence. He learned to read the complex power structures of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, identified which officials could be influenced and which were implacably hostile, and discovered that American politics operated according to rules that a clever man could manipulate to his advantage. His first great insight was that the Americans responded to leaders who could speak their language, literally and figuratively. Quana threw himself into mastering English with the dedication of a man whose people's survival depended on his success. He studied not just vocabulary and grammar, but the subtle nuances of tone and gesture that marked the difference between supplicant and negotiating partner. Within months, he was conducting business with government officials who had initially dismissed him as another ignorant savage. The transformation was remarkable to behold. The same man who had once terrified frontier settlements now charmed Washington bureaucrats with his combination of dignified bearing and practical intelligence. He learned to wear white man's clothing without appearing to abandon his identity, to speak of progress and civilization while quietly preserving Comanche traditions, and to present himself as a loyal American citizen while never forgetting that his ultimate loyalty was to his people. His breakthrough came when he discovered that American capitalism offered opportunities that traditional Comanche raiding never could. The reservation sat atop some of the richest grazing land in Oklahoma, and white cattlemen were desperate to lease that land for their herds. Previous Indian agents had simply pocketed the lease payments while giving the tribes nothing. But Quana recognized that the situation could be reversed. If the Comanche controlled their own negotiations, they could turn their former prison into a source of wealth that would make them partners rather than dependents in the American economy. The cattle lease negotiations that followed demonstrated Quana's political genius at its most refined. He played competing cattlemen against each other, driving up lease prices while securing increasingly favorable terms for his people. More importantly, he insisted on direct payments to tribal members rather than government-administered funds, creating the first significant income stream that allowed Comanche families to achieve a measure of economic independence. It was capitalism with Comanche characteristics, entrepreneurship in service of tribal sovereignty. His success in the cattle business opened doors that had been closed to every other indigenous leader. White businessmen who had initially approached him with the condescending attitudes reserved for conquered savages quickly learned to treat him as an equal partner whose word was his bond. His reputation for honest dealing spread throughout the territory, creating a network of allies who had strong financial incentives to support Comanche interests. But Quanah's most audacious innovation was his entry into national politics, where he leveraged his growing influence to protect his people from the worst excesses of federal Indian policy. He cultivated relationships with congressmen, senators, and even presidents, presenting himself not as a defeated chieftain, begging for mercy, but as a regional leader whose cooperation was essential for maintaining peace in the Southwest. His Washington connections allowed him to bypass hostile local officials and appeal directly to policymakers who had the authority to override bureaucratic persecution. The peyote controversy that erupted in the 1890s became the ultimate test of Quanah's political skills. The Native American church that he helped establish used the sacred cactus in religious ceremonies that federal agents condemned as heathen superstition. Christian missionaries demanded that peyote use be banned as incompatible with civilization and progress. But Quanah recognized that this was about more than religious freedom. It was a fight for the right of indigenous peoples to maintain their own spiritual traditions in the face of aggressive cultural assimilation. His defense of peyote rights was a masterpiece of political strategy that combined legal arguments with cultural education and personal testimony. He brought sympathetic white observers to peyote ceremonies, demonstrating that the rituals promoted sobriety and moral behavior, rather than the debauchery that critics claimed. He cited constitutional protections for religious freedom, arguing that Native Americans deserved the same rights guaranteed to other American citizens. Most effectively, he used his own life story as evidence that traditional spiritual practices were compatible with success in white society. The campaign succeeded because Quanah had learned to speak to American values while defending Comanche traditions. He presented peyote use as a form of temperance that helped Native Americans avoid alcohol, an argument that resonated with progressive-era reformers who were already fighting against the liquor industry. He emphasized the peaceful nature of peyote ceremonies, contrasting them with the violence that Americans associated with savage religious practices. Most importantly, he positioned himself as a modern Indian leader who could bridge the gap between two worlds, rather than a traditional chief clinging to an obsolete past. His personal life during these years reflected the same strategic thinking that governed his public career. Quanah maintained multiple wives according to Comanche tradition, despite constant pressure from government agents to adopt monogamous Christian marriage. But he presented this as a matter of honor and responsibility. He couldn't abandon women who had married him under traditional law without dishonoring his ancestors and betraying his obligations as a leader. It was cultural preservation, disguised as Victorian morality. The ranch house he built near Cache, Oklahoma, became a symbol of his successful navigation between worlds. The structure itself was thoroughly American, a large, comfortable home that would not have looked out of place in any prosperous farming community. But the eagle feathers that decorated the walls, the peyote ceremonies conducted in the parlor, and the constant stream of Comanche visitors who came seeking his counsel marked it as something entirely different. The capital of a government in exile, the headquarters of a people who had lost their territory, but not their identity. By 1900, Quanah had achieved something unprecedented in the history of American Indian relations. He had transformed his people from conquered enemies into prosperous American citizens without abandoning their essential Comanche identity. The former war chief who had once struck terror into frontier settlements was now invited to dine with presidents and speak at patriotic gatherings where he was introduced as a living symbol of successful assimilation. But those who saw only surface accommodation missed the deeper reality of what Quanah had accomplished. He had preserved the core of Comanche culture by adapting its external forms to American expectations. He had maintained tribal unity by channeling traditional loyalties toward new goals. Most importantly, he had demonstrated that indigenous peoples could engage with American society as equals rather than dependents, participants rather than victims in the ongoing creation of national identity. The reservation years had begun with the death of the Comanche Empire, but they ended with the birth of something equally remarkable: a new form of indigenous leadership that would influence Native American politics for generations to come. Quana Parker had proven that even the most devastating defeat could be transformed into a different kind of victory, and that the skills that made great war chiefs could also make great peacetime leaders. The Lords of the Plains had learned to rule from within the very system that had conquered them, and their influence was just beginning. General George S. Patton Jr. stood before his armored divisions in the Bavarian countryside of 1945, explaining the tactical principles that would carry them across the Rhine and into the heart of Nazi Germany. "We will advance rapidly, strike without warning, and disappear before the enemy can react," he told his tank commanders. "Hit fast, hit hard, and get out, just like the Comanche." Few of the young officers understood the reference, but Patton did. He had studied the Plains Wars as a cadet at West Point, had learned to appreciate the tactical genius of warriors who had revolutionized warfare with nothing more than horses and arrows. Now, commanding the most sophisticated, mechanized force in human history, he was applying lessons first taught by Quanah Parker and his ancestors on the grasslands of Texas. The irony was exquisite and deeply American. The nation that had destroyed the Comanche Empire had absorbed its most valuable innovations and made them the foundation of its own military doctrine. The lightning war that carried American forces across Europe and the Pacific wasn't just technological superiority. It was the strategic thinking of nomadic warriors adapted to an industrial age. Blitzkrieg itself was a Comanche warfare writ large. The same principles of mobility, surprise, and psychological impact that had terrorized two continents now applied with tanks instead of horses. But the Comanche influence on American military thinking began long before Patton's tank columns. The U.S. Army officers who had fought on the plains carried hard-won lessons back to staff colleges and strategy seminars, where they became foundational doctrine for a new kind of warfare. The rigid European tactics that had dominated American military thinking since the Revolution gave way to more flexible approaches that emphasized mobility over firepower, initiative over adherence to doctrine, and the creative exploitation of terrain, advantages over frontal assault. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie, the officer who had finally defeated Quana Parker, became one of the most influential military theorists of his generation, precisely because he understood what the Comanche had taught him. His lectures at West Point emphasized the importance of intelligence gathering, rapid movement, and the psychological dimensions of warfare. All lessons learned the hard way in the canyons and prairies of Texas. When Mackenzie spoke about the need for armies to think like Indians, his students listened because they knew he had faced the finest light cavalry in the world and lived to tell about it. The transformation wasn't limited to formal military doctrine. The Texas Rangers, those legendary frontier lawmen, had learned their craft-fighting Comanche war parties and had internalized every lesson their enemies could teach. Their emphasis on individual initiative, their mastery of mounted combat, and their understanding of how small groups of highly trained men could control vast territories became the template for elite military units that would serve America through 2 world wars and beyond. The Rangers didn't just fight like Comanche, they thought like Comanche, adapting indigenous tactical principles to the needs of a modern state. Perhaps most remarkably, the Comanche had forced a fundamental redefinition of what constituted military professionalism in America. The European model of warfare that dominated thinking before the Plains Wars emphasized rigid discipline, formal training, and adherence to established doctrine. But the Comanche had proven that individual initiative, creative thinking, and adaptive leadership could triumph over superior numbers and technology. The U.S. Army that emerged from the Indian Wars was fundamentally different from the one that had entered them. More flexible, more innovative, and more willing to learn from unconventional enemies. The cultural impact was equally profound, though often hidden beneath layers of mythology and misunderstanding. The Comanche had demonstrated that American expansion wasn't the inevitable triumph of civilization over savagery that politicians claimed, but a collision between two sophisticated societies with fundamentally different approaches to power and territory. This recognition, even when grudgingly admitted, forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about their own national mythology. The cowboy legend that became central to American identity was built on Comanche foundations, though few recognized the connection. The horsemanship skills that made cowboys legendary, the open-range cattle industry that defined the American West, even the romantic mythology of freedom and independence that surrounded frontier life. All of these drew heavily on innovations that the Comanche had pioneered. The cattle drives that captured the American imagination followed routes that Comanche war parties had used for centuries, through territories that the lords of the plains had controlled long before any white man saw them. The very concept of the American frontier, that moving boundary between civilization and wilderness that supposedly defined the national character, was fundamentally shaped by Comanche resistance. For 2 centuries, that frontier had been wherever Comanche power ended, not where white settlement began. The Comanche had determined the pace and direction of American expansion more effectively than any government policy or military campaign. When Frederick Jackson Turner proclaimed in 1893 that the frontier had finally closed, he was really announcing that Comanche power had finally been broken. The political innovations that the Comanche had pioneered found their way into American democratic theory through channels that political scientists are still trying to trace. Their federal system of autonomous bands cooperating for mutual benefit provided a working model of how diverse groups could maintain their identities while participating in larger political structures. Their emphasis on consensus building and merit-based leadership offered alternatives to the top-down authority structures that dominated European political thinking. Women's rights advocates of the Progressive era frequently cited Comanche society as proof that gender equality was compatible with social stability and military effectiveness. The economic independence that Comanche women enjoyed, their influence in political decision-making, and their role in determining marriage arrangements provided powerful arguments against those who claimed that traditional gender roles were natural and unchangeable. Elizabeth Cady Stanton herself pointed to Plains tribes as examples of societies that had achieved the equality that American women were still fighting to secure. The environmental movement that emerged in the 20th century drew heavily on Comanche models of sustainable resource management, though often without acknowledging the source. The Plains tribes had maintained stable populations and preserved ecosystem health for millennia through practices that industrial society was only beginning to understand. Their seasonal hunting patterns, their careful management of fire ecology, and their understanding of carrying capacity provided blueprints for environmental policies that wouldn't be formally adopted until the age of ecological crisis. Even American business culture absorbed Comanche influences, particularly in the areas of risk management and entrepreneurial thinking. The Comanche approach to trade, based on relationships rather than contracts, on reputation rather than enforcement mechanisms, offered a model of commercial activity that emphasized trust and long-term thinking over short-term exploitation. Successful frontier merchants learned to do business the Comanche way, and many of the practices they developed became standard throughout the American economy. The psychological impact was perhaps the most profound of all. The Comanche had forced Americans to confront the reality that their expansion across the continent wasn't the inevitable triumph of a superior civilization, but a hard-fought victory over formidable opponents who had mastered skills that European societies had forgotten. This recognition bred a kind of grudging respect that gradually evolved into something approaching admiration for enemies who had fought with such skill and determination. The transformation of Comanche leaders from hated enemies into romantic figures took less than a generation. By 1900, Quana Parker was being invited to 4th of July celebrations and Wild West shows, where he was presented not as a conquered savage but as a noble warrior who had fought honorably for his people's freedom. This rehabilitation wasn't just sentimentality. It reflected a genuine recognition that the Comanche had embodied virtues that Americans claimed as their own: independence, courage, and the willingness to fight against overwhelming odds for the right to live according to their own values. The military innovations continued to evolve throughout the 20th century. The close air support tactics that dominated World War II battlefields owed much to Comanche principles of coordination between mounted and dismounted forces. The Special Operations Forces that became crucial to modern warfare operated according to organizational principles that would have been immediately recognizable to any Comanche war chief. The emphasis on intelligence gathering, rapid deployment, and psychological warfare that characterized American military doctrine from Vietnam to Afghanistan reflected lessons first learned on the staked plains of Texas. Perhaps most significantly, the Comanche had demonstrated that indigenous peoples were capable of innovation and adaptation on a scale that challenged every assumption about cultural evolution and historical progress. They had transformed themselves from a marginal mountain tribe into the dominant power across half a continent through sheer force of will and tactical brilliance. Their example provided proof that cultures could reinvent themselves completely without losing their essential identity, a lesson that would prove invaluable as America itself struggled to adapt to the challenges of global leadership. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Comanche legacy had become so thoroughly integrated into American culture that most people couldn't identify its origins. The military doctrine that projected American power around the world, the business practices that drove economic expansion, the political principles that governed federal-state relationships, even the environmental policies that sought to balance development with conservation, all bore the imprint of innovations first developed by the lords of the plains. The thunder of Comanche horses had long since faded from the prairies, but its echoes continued to shape the nation that had once trembled at their approach. The empire built on horseback had fallen, but its ideas had conquered the civilization that had destroyed it. In the end, perhaps that was the most Comanche victory of all. On a September morning in 2016, a Comanche businessman named Ron Parker, great-great-grandson of Quanah Parker, walked into a boardroom in Lawton, Oklahoma, carrying a laptop computer and a sacred eagle feather. He was there to negotiate a multi-million-dollar contract for his tribe's energy development company. But the feather reminded everyone present that this wasn't just another corporate meeting. It was the continuation of a conversation that had begun when the first Comanche warrior traded with Spanish colonists 3 centuries earlier. How do you maintain your identity while thriving in someone else's world? The answer, as Ron Parker's ancestors had discovered, was that you don't thrive in someone else's world. You make the world your own. The Comanche nation of the 21st century bears little outward resemblance to the horse-mounted empire that once controlled the southern plains. Yet anyone familiar with their history would recognize the essential continuity. The same adaptability that transformed mountain-dwelling Shoshone into masters of mounted warfare has allowed their descendants to become leaders in everything, from aerospace engineering to professional athletics. The same strategic thinking that enabled Quana Parker to outmaneuver Washington bureaucrats now guides tribal leaders who operate casinos, oil companies, and technology firms that compete successfully in global markets. The numbers alone tell a story of remarkable revival. From a population that had dwindled to fewer than 1,500 people in 1900, the Comanche Nation has grown to more than 17,000 enrolled members scattered across all 50 states and several foreign countries. They include Air Force pilots flying stealth bombers, software engineers designing cutting-edge applications, medical researchers developing new treatments for diabetes, and professional athletes competing at the highest levels of American sports. The genetic heritage that once produced the finest light cavalry in North America now produces astronauts, entrepreneurs, and Nobel Prize candidates. The tribal headquarters in Lawton might be housed in modern office buildings rather than buffalo hide teepees, but the political structure that governs contemporary Comanche life would be immediately recognizable to any 19th century chief. The Comanche Business Committee operates according to principles of consensus and merit-based leadership that have remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Decisions are still made through extensive consultation with elders and community members. Authority still derives from demonstrated competence rather than hereditary status, and individual bands, now organized as family societies and cultural groups, still maintain considerable autonomy within the larger tribal structure. The economic innovations that characterize modern Comanche enterprises reflect the same entrepreneurial spirit that once made their ancestors the premier horse traders of the plains. The Comanche Nation Casino, opened in 1995, wasn't just another gaming operation, but a carefully calculated strategy to generate revenue that could fund education, healthcare, and cultural preservation programs. Like the cattle leases that Quana Parker negotiated in the 1880s, it represented the adaptation of traditional Comanche business acumen to contemporary opportunities. But the casino was only the beginning. The Comanche Nation College, established in 2002, has become a model for tribally controlled higher education that combines rigorous academic standards with cultural education that previous generations had been forbidden to receive. Students can earn degrees in business administration or computer science, while studying Comanche language and traditional ecological knowledge. It's exactly the kind of institution that Quana Parker would have understood, a way to master the skills needed for success in the dominant society, while preserving the knowledge that makes them distinctly Comanche. The language revitalization programs that have emerged in recent decades represent perhaps the most crucial battle in the ongoing fight for cultural survival. When the last fluent speakers of Comanche began dying in the 1990s, tribal leaders faced the terrifying prospect that their language, the repository of centuries of accumulated wisdom, might disappear forever. The response was characteristically Comanche. They fought back with every resource at their disposal, using modern technology to preserve ancient knowledge. The Comanche Language and Cultural Preservation Committee has created digital archives that preserve thousands of hours of elder interviews, developed smartphone apps that teach traditional vocabulary, and established immersion programs that are producing a new generation of fluent speakers. It's warfare by other means, a battle for cultural survival, fought with the same determination that their ancestors brought to military campaigns, but using laptops instead of lances. The powwows and cultural celebrations that anchor contemporary Comanche social life serve functions that go far beyond entertainment or nostalgia. These gatherings, held throughout the year across Comanche territory, provide opportunities for scattered family groups to maintain the kinship networks that have always been the foundation of tribal society. A software engineer living in Silicon Valley can return to Oklahoma for the annual Comanche Homecoming and immediately reconnect with relatives, renew cultural knowledge, and participate in ceremonies that link him to ancestors who rode with Quana Parker. The traditional arts that flourish in contemporary Comanche communities reflect the same innovation within continuity that has always characterized their culture. Modern artists create beadwork and silverwork that honors traditional designs while incorporating contemporary materials and techniques. Musicians blend traditional songs with modern instruments, creating music that sounds both ancient and cutting-edge. It's cultural evolution in real time, the same process that once transformed a pedestrian mountain tribe into mounted conquerors of the plains. The political influence that the Comanche Nation wields in contemporary Oklahoma reflects both their growing economic power and their sophisticated understanding of American political systems. Tribal leaders regularly lobby Congress on issues affecting Native Americans, negotiate directly with state officials on matters of jurisdiction and taxation, and maintain diplomatic relationships with other tribes that create powerful coalitions for mutual advantage. It's the same multi-level political strategy that enabled their ancestors to play Spanish, French, and American authorities against each other, adapted to the complex federal system of modern America. The environmental activism that has become central to contemporary Comanche identity draws directly on traditional ecological knowledge that sustained plains nomadism for centuries. Tribal scientists work with federal agencies to restore prairie ecosystems, develop sustainable energy projects that honor traditional relationships with the natural world, and advocate for policies that balance economic development with environmental protection. They understand, as their ancestors did, that long-term prosperity depends on maintaining the health of the landscape that sustains all life. Perhaps most remarkably, the Comanche have managed to achieve economic success and political influence while maintaining relationships with the very institutions that once sought to destroy them. The U.S. Army, which fought bitter campaigns against Comanche warriors, now recruits heavily from tribal communities and counts many Comanche soldiers among its most decorated veterans. Fort Sill, where Quanah Parker surrendered in 1875, has become a site of pilgrimage where tribal members honor both their ancestors' resistance and their contemporary service to America. The annual Quana Parker Star Quilt ceremony at Fort Sill embodies this complex relationship between past and present, resistance and accommodation. Hundreds of Comanche gather at the site where their greatest chief chose survival over glory, where they present star quilts, symbols of honor in Plains culture, to military officials and community leaders who have supported tribal interests. It's reconciliation without surrender, a way of honoring the past while building bridges to the future. The challenges facing the contemporary Comanche nation are as complex as any their ancestors confronted. Diabetes rates remain stubbornly high among tribal members, reflecting both genetic predisposition and the dietary changes that accompanied forced sedentarization. Substance abuse problems affect families already struggling with the intergenerational trauma of cultural suppression and forced assimilation. Many young people still leave the reservation for educational and economic opportunities, creating ongoing concerns about cultural continuity and community cohesion. But the response to these challenges reflects the same resilience and adaptability that enabled survival through 2 centuries of warfare, forced relocation, and cultural suppression. Tribal health programs combine traditional healing practices with modern medical techniques, addressing both the symptoms and underlying causes of contemporary health problems. Youth programs provide alternatives to substance abuse by connecting young people with cultural traditions and educational opportunities that build self-esteem and community pride. The Comanche veterans, who have served in every American military conflict since World War I, embody the complex relationship between tribal identity and national citizenship that defines contemporary Native American life. They serve their country with distinction while maintaining their identity as members of a sovereign nation that existed long before the United States was imagined. Their military service honors both the warrior traditions of their ancestors and their commitment to the democratic ideals that America represents at its best. As the Comanche Nation approaches the 150th anniversary of Quanah Parker's surrender, tribal leaders are planning commemorative events that will celebrate not just survival, but triumph. The people who were once dismissed as relics of a vanishing past have proven their critics wrong by becoming leaders in fields that didn't exist when the reservation gates first closed. They have demonstrated that Indigenous peoples can not only adapt to modernity, but help shape it according to their own values and vision. The Empire of the Four Winds may have fallen, but its spirit lives on in boardrooms and classrooms, research laboratories, and military bases, wherever Comanche people apply the lessons of their ancestors to the challenges of contemporary life. The thunder of horses' hooves has been replaced by the hum of computers and the roar of jet engines. But the echoes across time remind us that some things never change. The power of a people who refuse to surrender their identity, no matter what the world demands of them. The Lords of the Plains have simply found new plains to conquer,